Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum. We begin today on verse number 23 of the second chapter. In the earlier verse 22, Krishna gives the example of the body and mind being like a cloth. And death simply means when the cloth becomes old, worn out, we then exchange it for a new cloth. But the clothes may change, the body and mind may change, but the unchanging reality within the Atman, that does not change. So how is that Atman unchanging that he described in verse 23? Nainam chindanti shastrani, nainam dahati pavakaha, na chainam kledayantyapo, na shoshayati marutaha. Weapons do not cut this self, fire does not burn this, water does not wet this, wind does not dry this. So, all the change that occurs in the material world occurs through matter acting and interacting upon each other, the material particles. And the 5 primary elements are said to be space, air, fire, water, and earth. So these 5 primary elements in their various combinations act and interact upon each other, and that's how any change in the material world occurs. And that's why it is said, weapons do not cut the self. That's essentially one way we find change and destruction occurs in the world, through weapons. That's one way of metal cutting through the body and so on. Fire, water, and wind. The body is affected by all of these. These act and interact upon the body, but they do not act and interact upon the Atman. And of course, there is this one reason which can apply everywhere, and that is nothing can interact upon the Atman because ultimately there is nothing apart from the Atman. So Atman is the only reality, and so in the absolute sense, nothing can act upon it because there is nothing else. But even in a relative sense, the Atman is pure consciousness, and therefore material things, material, the word for matter in Sanskrit is jada, and Atman is Chaitanya. So consciousness and material things don't act and interact upon each other. Because that is so, therefore, the next verse continues on verse 24. Achedyoyam adayyoyam akledyo shoshya evacha nitya sarvagatasthānuhu achaloyam sanatanaha. This self can neither be cut, nor burnt, nor wetted, nor dried. The self is eternal, all-pervading, unmoving, immovable, and indestructible. Now, in some sense, this is a repetition of what is said before. The earlier words said, the fire cannot burn it, water cannot wet it, air cannot dry it. And this is more or less repeating the same idea. The self cannot be cut, nor burnt, nor wetted, nor dried. Now, each of these adjectives given here, that this self is eternal, all-pervading, unmoving, immovable, and indestructible. In Sanskrit, nityaha, sarvagataha, sthanuhu, achalaha, sanatanaha. So each could be seen as a cause of that which succeeds. So because the self is eternal, and therefore there cannot be 2 infinites. There are 2 infinites, they will limit each other. So because the self is eternal, it is the only reality, and therefore it's all-pervading. And because it is all-pervading, it is unmoving. No one can It cannot move. There is no place else for it to move because it's the only reality. And because it is unmoving, nobody else can move it because there is nobody else. So it's immovable. And again, that one reason that it's the only reality stands also by it is indestructible. Sanatanaha. So the only entity within us, which is eternal, all-pervading, the most stable thing, is this Atman. Everything else, the mind keeps on changing, the body keeps on changing. Theoretically, what we need to do is actually quite simple. Just hold on to the Atman. It's what we do when there is a hurricane or a storm. People know that being outdoors can be dangerous when there is a huge winds blowing. So what do? Normally there are these storm shelters. We go into the basement or somewhere where even if the structures above the ground are blown away, we are still stable. No external winds can affect us. In some sense, the Atman is the storm shelter. There are all these storms and things continually changing in the external world and affecting us, both physically and mentally, emotionally, and so on. If we are located above the ground, that is somewhere connected with the body and mind, whatever happens to the body and mind will seem to happen to me. But if I go deep inside this firm, unmoving reality, then there could be a nuclear war going outside, and yet I know even the atom bomb cannot do anything to the Atman. So the only way people nowadays have the cameras, outdoor cameras, because of thieves coming and all those. So we try to do our best to keep things safe. And of course, we should do it as much as we can, but recognizing from a spiritual standpoint, the only safety, the foolproof safety, is really in just knowing that I am the Atman. All other safety things are good as far as they go, but they all have limitations. And this safety thing, there is no subscription. That's who I am. So it's completely free. People pay so much for safety reasons, and this is something which is freely available. So one question that can come, and I have mentioned this on earlier occasions, this constant repetition, a lot of these descriptions of the Atman given here in the verses, it's not as if every verse is telling something new. And so sometimes repetition is considered a defect in a text. And of course, all of you who have been attending the classes, you know how often I keep on repeating the same things. And we might say, why do you have to keep on saying this? When we read the Gospel of Ramakrishna, it's not as if every page there is a new teaching. A lot of time the stories are repeated, the songs are repeated, the teachings are repeated. And the reason for that is, these are the things we tend to forget very often. We often remember the birthdays and phone numbers nowadays, very few people remember because it's all stored in your devices. But there were times when people, before the smart gadgets came, people used to remember phone numbers and so on. So there are a lot of things we remember. One thing we tend to forget often is that I am this infinite Atman. So if we can remember so many other things, why can't you remember this one little thing? That I am this infinite Atman, that the body and mind are only coverings. And because we tend to forget it so often, Krishna is repeating it over and over and over again for our benefit. So we continue on verse 25. Avyaktoyam achintyoyam avikaryoyam uchyate tasmadevam viditvainam nanushochitumarhasi. This self is hidden. This self is unthinkable. This self is unchangeable. Knowing this as such, you should not grieve. Now, what does it mean by hidden, avyaktam? Vyakta means it is manifested, it's visible, it's tangible. Avyakta means it is not visible, not tangible, it is hidden. Now, why is it hidden? Because there are no you see, to see some things, we need an instrument. Now, clearly, there are a lot of things we can just see with our naked eyes, and that they are not hidden. But there are some microorganisms, they are hidden. They are hidden because our eyes don't have the ability to see them. But if you go to a laboratory and then get a good microscope, and then maybe through the help of that microscope, we'll be able to see these tiny little things which simply eyes cannot see. If you get even more powerful microscope, you can see even smaller thing. Or if you get a powerful telescope, you'll be able to scan the skies and see the planets and distant galaxies and so on. So if we have the instrument, the right instrument, we can see things that normally with our body and mind we cannot. But the Atman, there are no instruments to see the Atman. And that is why it is avyakta, it's hidden. Why is it unthinkable? Achintyaha. Unthinkable because in order to think, we need some kind of a sensory data. Unless the senses grasp something, whether it's a visual or a sound or a touch or a smell, something, we need something to think about. No senses can grasp the Atman. So it's something that cannot be thought about. Unchangeable. Avikari. Unchangeable in the sense that just like milk changes into yogurt, Atman doesn't change into anything. Also, for any change to occur, change oftentimes in the material world can mean either a rearrangement of the parts inside something or losing a certain part and adding something else. That's the only way change is possible. Either some particular part goes away or additional something comes in, or there is the internal readjustment of the particles. Now, in the Atman, there are no parts. And so none of these things is possible. So no change is possible in the Atman. That's why it's unchangeable. And so that is why what Krishna says, Natvam shochitum arhasi. Tasmat evam enam viditva anushochitum na arhasi. So knowing the Atman to be hidden, to be unthinkable and unchangeable, you should not grieve. Because first of all, he has said, the weapons cannot cut it. So you might think that in this battlefield, you are the greatest archer in the world. With your arrows, you are going to kill them all. You cannot kill anybody. And the Arjuna's grief has come from that awareness. These are the people who I see as my own. I'm going to kill them, or they are going to get killed by me. And what Krishna is pointing out is, you cannot kill anyone. Don't feel bad about it, because they are not the body and mind. You are not the body and mind. They are the Atman, which cannot be cut. You are the Atman who doesn't go and kill anybody. So from that absolute standpoint, there is no killer, there is no killed. And so your grief is totally misplaced. Next verse. So what Krishna is saying in the next verse is, even now, so far he has been speaking about the true self, the Atman which is eternal. But he says, even if we, as popularly, most people we meet in life, including ourselves, we don't generally go about thinking of, oh, I am the eternal being. Well, if we can always remember that, then we are already enlightened. So, for most of us, as we go through our day-to-day activities, we think about, yes, I'm existing, I'm here now, but I wasn't here before I was born. I won't be here after I am dead. So we do, in our lived experience of the self, we do treat it as if it is transitory. It's something that begins at birth and ends at death. So what Krishna is saying is, even if you try to think of the self, not in the way I have mentioned before about the eternal, unthinkable, unmoving, immovable, and so on, but even if you think of the self as transitory, even then your grief is misplaced. He says, Athachainam nitya jatam nityam va manyase mritam tathapi tvam mahabaho nainam shochitumarhasi. But, O mighty armed, even if you think of this self as routinely taking birth and dying, you should not grieve for it. The idea is, if something that, even if we accept that the self comes and the self goes, at birth it comes, at death it goes, even then why should we grieve? If things happen as they are predicted, as things routinely happen, if the sun sets, we don't grieve and say, oh, the sun is gone, it's all darkness everywhere. We don't do that because we know, well, if the sun has risen in the morning, it's going to set in the evening. If it sets in the evening, it's going to rise again tomorrow morning. So we don't grieve over it. If winter comes, we might say, oh, winter, and we hope it's not so cold, and some people may not be looking forward to a winter. But again, we don't grieve over it. We know, well, whether we like it or not, unless you want to pack up and go to Florida or something. If you are here, you have to face the winter, but also know that, well, winter will come, followed by spring, then summer. So things which happen in a predictable cycle, we don't generally grieve over them. So even if we think of the self as coming and going, birth and death, not as this eternal entity, even then there is no reason for you to grieve. This whole section that we are studying can be seen as a sometimes people have this therapy, grief therapy, people who are grieving, and of course there are different systems of dealing with grief. This is Krishna as a therapist. He's seeing Arjuna is grieving, and is a little bit of an unusual therapist. And if you go to a therapist and say the self is eternal, then you say, no, tell me something more practical. It is like there is a story I have heard about Ramana Maharshi, because he was very fond of this self, always referring to this Atman. And so there was one of his devotees who was very devoted to Ramana Maharshi, and then he goes to him, and he really is having some big, major crisis, both in the family and in his own personal life. And so he has great faith in Ramana Maharshi, and so he goes to him and then says, this is the problem I'm having at home. Please tell me what I should do. And he is accustomed to the approach of Ramana Maharshi, and he says, but don't ask me whose problem it is. Don't tell me about the Atman. Tell me something more practical. And Ramana Maharshi also smiled. There's another one, a lovely story I like very much, is another one great devotee. Again, Ramana Maharshi himself, sometimes we tend to pigeonhole people into, oh, he's a jnani, all the Atman, as if everything else is absent in him. But these enlightened beings, they have everything. They have bhakti, jnana, everything in full measure. We cannot even pigeonhole Sri Ramakrishna as, oh, he's a bhakta or a jnani. We find everything in fuller measure in him. So in Ramana Maharshi, therefore, there were people who were devoted to him and not all just always thinking about the Atman. There were a lot of very sincere, devotion-minded people who were very devoted to him. So here was this one bhakta, was a devotee of Mahavishnu or Narayana. And so he once goes to, with tears, he goes to Ramana Maharshi and says, one great hope, my life's ambition is after I die, I just want to go to Vaikuntha and have darshan of Narayana and be in the presence of Mahavishnu. Will it happen? do you think that books say that there is Vaikuntha and there is Narayana? Is it true? That's what I want. And normally one would have thought, Ramakrishna said, oh, there is nothing, it's all imagination of the mind, it's all the Atman. That's not what he said. Ramana Maharshi said, yes, there is Vaikuntha. You will have darshan of Narayana and Lakshmi there. And then this devotee is so happy. Then he said, and then Ramana Maharshi said, what will you do when you go there? And then he says, well, I'll go to Sashtang Namaskar to Vishnu. I'll just be at his presence. And then he asked Ramana Maharshi, but when I do all this, what will Narayana say to me? What will Vishnu tell me? And then Ramana Maharshi said, Vishnu will tell you, find out who you are. I mean, and such a sweet, I just love this story. It's like taking everyone at where they are and helping them onward. That's what Krishna is doing here. We don't know. We don't know at what level Krishna saw Arjuna to be, but he's giving him all the different ways of dealing with grief. He spoke to him about the Atman being infinite, but he says, even if you cannot think of that, then even if you think about it as in a normal way most of us think about, even then there is no reason for you to grieve. He continues that in verse 27. Jatasya dhruvo mrityuhu dhruvam janma mritasya cha tasmat apariharyerthe natvam shochitum arhasi. Death is certain for whoever is born, and birth is certain for whoever it dies. Therefore, you should not grieve for what is inevitable. We see that generally in life, the human mind has enormous capacity. And oftentimes we don't allow that potentiality of the mind to flourish. We see that there are times in life when something drastic happens, both good or bad. Drastic sometimes used only in terms of bad, but some big change occurs in life. Usually we think that, if something really good happens, we can deal with it. That's like easy. Only if something bad happens, then there is a problem. But not so. Even if something, there have been people who have gone crazy not knowing what to do, that they won a lottery and then overnight become, say, 500 million you get. And one might think, you could be so happy. And maybe one could be immediately. But then it's like, what am I going to do with this? So any big change, positive or negative, throws us off balance a little bit. But once that initial shock or a joy, either way, goes away, something that is inevitable, then the mind somehow makes peace with it, or at least says how I can deal with it, goes about it. And that's what Krishna is saying here, that birth and death are certain. That which is born will die, that which is die will be born. And we see that, in fact, now there's so much about recycled products, and we encourage and we feel good that they are not just trashing things, but somehow these things can get recycled somehow. Even objects which are sent to the dumping ground, they find ways, at least those things which can be used or reused in some other form and recycled is helpful. And in some ways, that is essentially what is happening in the material world. Even the bodies that we have, after they are burnt or cremated, will become a heap of ashes or dust and returns back to the material world. And it's from this whole material universe that new bodies will come into being. And not just living bodies, even entities, even products that we buy. Again, they are the same material products in different combination, different form, different shapes, different colors, but it's all being recycled. And therefore, recognizing that this is inevitable, make peace with it. There is no need to grieve. So a lot of these verses are ending with this one refrain, Natvam shochitum arhasi, shoka. No need for you to do shoka. Verse 28. Avyaktadini bhutani vyaktamadhyani bharata avyakta nidhananyeva tatra ka paridevana. O Bharata, all beings are hidden in the beginning, become manifest in the middle state, and then get hidden again in the end. What is the use of grieving? Again, the same idea. Coming and going is natural. What's the point of grieving over it? Because, as I said before, we don't grieve over the setting of the sun or the changing of the season cycle. There is one verse in the Mahabharata, and Gita itself is in the Mahabharata, in another section of the Mahabharata called the Stri Parva. There is this one word which says, Adarshanat apatitaha punascha adarshanam gataha nasau tava natasyatvam vritha ka paridevana. Now, before I explain what this verse is, I need to say a few things, because up to this point, and yes, mostly up to this point, Krishna keeps on saying you shouldn't grieve, you shouldn't grieve, you shouldn't grieve. And this is a different approach, we might say, to dealing with grief. On the face of it, saying you should not grieve appears to be a rather heartless thing. There is death, there is war, people are going to die, and shouldn't we grieve? In modern forms of therapy, people are encouraged to express themselves, express their feelings, express their emotions, not to keep them bottled up inside. And that's a good advice, because if we are not trained, if the mind hasn't become strong enough to be able to deal with these feelings of grief and all these other negativities that sometimes can fill our heart, then expressing them, venting them out is a form of release, does bring some amount of relief. And of course, if there is a good therapist, because feelings are so internal, if you just keep it inside, even a good therapist cannot help. So if the therapist or any friend or someone with whom we are sharing our feelings, if that person has to help us, then that person should first know what is going on inside. And therefore, expressing one's grief, expressing one's emotions is in fact encouraged. And now here Krishna is telling Arjuna, no, you should not grieve, no grieving. He is not saying, okay, come on, I'll say, tell me what is worrying you. Arjuna did a lot of speaking in the beginning when Krishna was listening. But the idea is this, that grieving is not a solution to anything. A grieving does not solve a problem. It might release the tension inside. It might make us feel a little bit free, but grief is such a thing. Unless that grief is processed somehow, it will keep on coming. It's not something that, I just grieve and then it's gone and now I'm free. Because that unprocessed, it's like it will continuously keep on coming. So yes, if the mind is not strong enough, not trained enough, then expressing one's all these emotions and feelings may have some utility, even if it is somewhat temporary. And what Krishna is doing here is showing another way for someone whose mind is a little bit stronger. Because the way to process all the things that are happening inside us, things that are happening outside us, is to look, learn, make sense of it, and respond to it in a positive way, respond to it in a wise way. And grieving, grieving is neither a positive way nor a wise way. Not grieving can sometimes be mistaken to be a very heartless thing. That's the kind of a society and in which we live. I remember one of our Swamis was telling me years ago. So he said that his father passed away when he was very young, when he was maybe, I don't know, I remember the exact, but he was probably not more than 8 or 9 years old. A very little kid, his father. And so one memory that has stuck with him was when his father has passed away, the body is there and at home. Everyone in the family is crying and expressing their grief. And he said, he knew, he was sad. As much as he could understand at that age, he was sad. So he just sat by his father's body quietly, feeling profound sorrow inside, but not expressing it. And so he says his older brother came and beat him, saying, everybody's crying, there are no tears in your eyes. And of course, that memory has stuck with him. So so we can understand the situation that our community, our family, our society expects a certain kind of a response in certain kind of situations. But just because someone doesn't weep and wail and cry or express it externally, it doesn't mean that they are heartless, doesn't mean that they are rejoicing. It's possible to feel that grief, but be strong enough not to have it overflow outside and express itself in a physical way. In Arjuna's case, it did express itself. You remember, he says in the first chapter, I think, he says, my Roma harsha chajayate, gandivam this, my bow is slipping from my fingers, my whole body is shaking. So his grief, his confusion, his dilemma was expressing itself in a very clear way through his body. And so Krishna is seeing all this because he is there right next to him. And so when he is telling Arjuna, don't grieve, it wasn't like Arjuna was just sitting quietly. It was a profound crisis in Arjuna's case. And so that's what Krishna is telling you. So we need to recognize that, because this kind of a question can come. Such situations, not necessarily on a battlefield, but there are all these different kinds of battles we are all facing in life. It could be difficult situations, and the strong emotions that we feel inside. What shall we do with them? Is it good to just kind of go and express it, or make oneself strong in some way to say, yes, this is not to be in denial of what one is feeling, to recognize that, to see that and say, why is this happening? What am I reacting to? And that's all the teachings that Krishna has given come up to that. That yes, there is this war, that people will die. What does death mean? What does birth mean? Who exactly am I crying for? Even when we speak about mourning or grieving, that's a good question to ask. When someone passes away and when we grieve, who are we grieving for? Apparently, superficially, it might seem as if we are grieving for the person who passed away. But if we look deeply, really, we are grieving at our own loss. We are feeling bad for ourselves. For all we know, the person who has passed away is in a much better place. Maybe they're celebrating in this other realm that they have gone. Maybe that the one who passed away was suffering extremely in her body and mind. It's a big release for them, and it's a time of celebration for them. But everyone weeps and nobody celebrates because that would be bad protocol. It's like we are supposed to weep. But when we weep, we are weeping for our own loss. That person had a certain place in our life. That person's presence in our life added some meaning to my life, added some artha. And once that person goes away, that artha, that place that this person occupied in my life, now it's gone. At least the physical presence is gone. And then it's the emptiness that I feel inside, that I'm really grieving over my loss. Although people just sometimes speak about grieving for somebody else, it's often how we have been affected by that. And so what Krishna is pointing out here is that, yes, this is not to say that we are like walls or stones, that anything is happening and we are just like without any emotion. That's not the idea. Of course, we are human beings. Every one of us has a heart. If something good happens, of course we are going to rejoice. If something bad happens, of course we are going to feel bad and we are going to grieve. But should we allow these emotions and feelings inside us? Should we have them under control, or should we allow them to overwhelm us to the point that we don't know what to do, that we become helpless, that we are not able to see clearly that in this given point of time, what is my duty? And that's exactly what had happened to Arjuna. Because, yes, if he was giving, how terrible this war I have come to, I have to fight these people. It was not just an ordinary grief. He was unable to fight. That sense of clarity about what I should do at this minute, that had gone. And so, yes, things will happen in our life, things which will make us extremely happy, things which will make us extremely sad. But if we allow this positive or negative things to cover us, to overwhelm us, then we will not know. Our condition will be like Arjuna. We will not know what I should be doing now. What is my dharma now? What is my swadharma? This is the question that will come up now in the succeeding verses. That in this situation, in order for me to know what is my duty, these are the strong feeling. This is the difficult situation I am in. What is my duty? And so I should not become a victim of my circumstances. I should be able to rise above it. It's like people who go surfing. I've never done surfing, so if I make some stupid mistake, forgive me. But I normally think that people, as they go, and essentially they're expected to ride a wave. A big wave comes. Otherwise, if you don't know how to ride a wave, how to kind of remain on top, you can just go down and then the water will come and completely overwhelm us. Yes, so we are on this big, and that's the analogy often given in books about this whole Bhavasagara. It's an ocean, and big waves are coming, winds are blowing, and we have to know how to surf well, how to stay on top of the wave, not allow these waves to completely drown us in this. And that's what Krishna is trying to tell Arjuna here. So we will stop here. If you have any thoughts, ideas, feel free to share.
Hariom Swamiji. Swamiji, you gave the example of us remembering birthdays, and to me that happens because we have cues, social cues that remind us. What are some of the cues we can follow to remind ourselves of us being the Atman?
Yeah, good, very good question. We need to be creative about it. Some cues are pretty obvious, but also it's like people have a small shrine at home. And that's a cue, because at least we may not remember God all the time we are doing, but at least if we go inside the shrine or before a picture that reminds us or of our spiritual ideal, of our Ishta, then that is one cue. But sometimes, if some things have been there for a long time, we see them and don't see them because it just becomes like one more piece of furniture. So that shouldn't become. But we can also be more creative. We can kind of create points of mental association. I mean, it just depends on how creative we want to get. You wake up in the morning, you're going out for a walk. There is the sun has risen and there is this sunshine falling on you. You can enjoy that, but it's also possible to say sometimes this one of the names of the sun in Sanskrit is called Prabhakara. Kara is hand. Prabha is all these rays of the sun, or like hands through which the sun is coming and touching us. So it's possible like for a devotee to say, go out and there is this sun on you, just say, well, that's the mother. The mother reminds me of that shining effulgent presence up in the sky. But now, this beautiful warm sun rays on my body, it's mother's hand that is completely patting me, bathing me in that light. So looking at the sun can be a cue. Looking at if we are driving and use a red light, people often get irritated if you're kind of just stop at the red light if you're in a hurry. But it's possible to say, oh, that red light, that's the bindi, the dot on Holy Mother's forehead. And then you say, oh, that mother is looking at me. So if we we have so many cues around us. Nature provides us so many ways, so many excuses to think about God. So it's really up to us. Yeah.
Thank you, Swamiji. Swamiji, I don't know how to say this question, but like for Arjuna, because he's identified with the body and mind, the right thing to do is sure he'll feel grief because his loved ones will die, but to redirect that grief to the divine and do the right thing. But if there was an enlightened being instead of Arjuna there, and if he was in a state that he was not identified with his body or mind at all, then he was absorbed completely in the divine. In that state, he wouldn't be able to do anything, right? Then the right thing to do for him would even just be to not fight and just be absorbed, right? And so when Swamiji in your blog, you had said like non-reaction, I can only equate non-reaction to the second scenario I explained. Like, or is non-reaction also the first scenario, like redirecting the emotions?
Yes, it's like this. There are these, you could say, think in terms of three things. One is completely identified with the body and mind. The other is the one who is in samadhi, who is completely identified with the self. But then there is an intermediate stage when one is identified with the self and not in samadhi. In other words, it's possible, and that's what a Jivan Mukta is not all the time in samadhi. A Jivan Mukta does go, move and talk. All the conversation that Sri Ramakrishna had, he wouldn't have had those conversations if he was in samadhi. When he was in samadhi, he couldn't do. In fact, somebody had to support him. But other times, when he was talking, singing, dancing, he still was the Atman. His mind was still in presence of the Divine Mother. But he also saw the people. He could also speak with them. And so, it is possible to have that state of identification with the Atman, and then be in that interim state, aware of the world around, but not seeing the world as real the way an unenlightened person will see it. To some extent, Bhishma is like that. It wasn't like, oh, Bhishma, he is some misguided person, he's fighting on the wrong side of the battle. He was an enlightened being. But what he saw was that his body and mind and the circumstances in which it was, he felt he was doing his duty. And what Krishna was telling Arjuna is now do your duty. So it wasn't as if everyone on that battlefield were completely unenlightened people. There were enlightened people there. But they were just doing their duty. And if we do our duty in a detached way, not with any malice or hatred or anger, doing what needs to be done, then one doesn't get caught up in that karma cycle. And so essentially that is what Krishna will tell Arjuna. That yes, war is not pretty. Given a choice, of course you shouldn't fight. But right now you don't have a choice. Because then, as he will explain in the verses that we will see, why you should fight. Yes, there was a possibility. Arjuna could have just returned home. But then the consequences of Arjuna not fighting would have been worse than the consequences of Arjuna fighting. So it's a choice here between bad and worse, not between good and bad. And so that's why he says, yes, it's not a happy situation, but these are the reasons, both, whether you think of the self as eternal or whether you think of the self as being born and not undead, just the kind of a ordinary person's understanding of the self or the enlightened person's identity, understanding of the self. Either way, grief is not called for. And to some extent, this applies to all of us all the time. Even if there are situations in our life which can be extremely disappointing or extremely shattering in some ways, if we can somehow absorb all these external uncertainties of life, and by absorbing I mean not just that, just bear it. No, that's yes, forbearance is important, necessary, that's what Krishna says. But forbearance should lead to education. That yes, all these things are happening, I'm forbearing it, but through my experience of good and bad, pleasant and unpleasant, I'm learning, I'm growing, I'm evolving, and I'm becoming stronger, so that next time a similar situation comes, I should not be thrown about the way I'm thrown about now. Next time something happens, I know exactly what I should do. It's like if someone is experiencing an earthquake for the first time, maybe you have moved to California and you're not used to earthquakes, and then you have experienced first time, then you wouldn't know what to do. And you are kind of, depending on how strong the earthquake is. But let's say it was a terrible experience. But then that one experience teaches you, this is what I should do during earthquakes. Then if there is another earthquake, if I'm equally terrified, even more terrified, that I have not learnt anything from the first earthquake. But if I have learnt something, next time I'll be better. So similarly, these occasions for grief and anger and all these difficult situations will keep on coming in our life. But every time it comes, I should absorb it, look at it, learn from it, grow, and when it comes again, I'm somehow better equipped to deal with it. One of the adjectives Yama uses for Nachiketa in that book Kathopanishad, he says, in fact it's the Shankaracharya in his commentary mentions, Maharadavat akshobhyamanaha, means he says, Yama looks at Nachiketa and sees that his heart, his mind is like a huge lake which nothing can disturb the water of that lake. Oftentimes our minds can become so narrow. It's like a small little pond. Even a baby elephant goes in that pond, the whole water can get completely disturbed by that presence. But if even a bunch of elephants walk inside Lake Michigan, nothing. It's just huge. Nothing can disturb it. Similarly, if our minds remain like a narrow, shallow pond, then every little challenge, every little difficulty, we are going to be, what am I going to do? Or cry, I need to run to my therapist. Well, if we needed, we should. But at some point, We have to stop being that little pond. The goal is to become like this huge lake. So let all these difficulties come, challenges come in everyone's. One thing to remember, when difficulties come, we often become so self-centered, thinking, oh, this is so much happening to me. Everyone is happy. I'm the only one. Don't worry. Everyone has problems in the world. None of us is an exception. Different kinds of problems, yes. But what makes a difference between one person and another is how well or how badly they are able to cope with the problem. But problems everyone has. So at the very least, the purpose of us studying the Gita is that our hearts have to become big and deep like a big lake. Problems will come. We absorb them, we look at them, we learn from them, we grow. The next time a similar problem comes, we are a little bit wiser. And we keep on getting wiser day by day by day. A time will come, we'll be fully wise. And that's what being enlightened means. If enlightenment means being like 100% wisdom, why can't we just start with like even a 0.1% wisdom every day? That's not difficult, that's a little bit. But that's the way we want to kind of increase the depth. From a small little pond inside the heart, our goal is to become a lake, become like Nachiketa. And that's what Krishna is expecting of Arjuna. And in that sense, he says, you should not grieve. Become a lake. Don't grieve. Don't remain a small pond. That's the idea.
So, Arjuna was a very spiritual person because he went through with Dronacharya, with all the teachings that he had. So if Krishna was not standing with him what would he think he would have done? Because he was grieving, and see, this is like and any one of us here, we are not even anywhere near there, and spiritually, we are still a kind of, I call it infancy, even sometimes I call it. And so for any one of us to have that, not have Krishna by your side, then
what makes you think Krishna is not at your side?
No, but I know you have said sometime that, when you think about the universe is around and you think about you are an Atma, there is a whole...
No, I'm not even talking about Atma. Krishna.
Okay.
Krishna was not there only during Dwapara. And what's the point? Historical Krishna is gone, then we shouldn't even be reading this. Because it's not just Krishna's ideas that we are studying, but also to recognize that Krishna, Rama, Ramakrishna, Jesus, all these great ones, they just don't go. They are here right now. We may not be able to see them, but they are able to see us. So, we should not think that, oh, Krishna was by Arjuna's side and oh, who is by my side? If we look, we'll find Krishna by our side too. In fact, there is that one story, I think in Swami Vivekananda lectures he mentioned. So there was this one big Pandit giving a pravachana, a discourse on the Gita, and very scholarly, and people are just listening, very philosophical and so on. And there was this one person, very uneducated, couldn't follow much, was sitting just on the edge of the hall and weeping, profound tears. And then someone asked him, you're not able to follow a word of that philosophy that this person is teaching from the Gita, and yet you seem so much affected by that discourse. So why? Then this person says, I don't understand what they are saying, but I know they are talking about the Gita. And when I hear the Gita being chanted, I just see Krishna before me, and I see the chariot, and I see Arjuna. And seeing, just seeing Krishna before me, tears are coming. And then Swamiji says, he is studying the Gita more than people who are just dealing with concepts and ideas. And so I think that's something we all need to remember. Yes, we just talk a lot of philosophy here, a lot of ideas and concepts. But at no point should we ever forget that this is not simply concepts and ideas. that Krishna is present, that Arjuna is present in our heart. We are the Arjunas. Every one of us is the Arjuna. And what Krishna is saying is not to that Arjuna. Krishna is saying all this to every one of us. We have to make this teaching personal. Then it'll hit the right spot. So we're not just studying some historical document. I think it's very helpful to keep that in mind. That's what makes a difference between a non-fiction book and a scripture. A scripture is something that is present. It's not about the past. It's about a direct connection we have with the teaching itself. Yeah. So we will stop here today. When we meet next time, we'll begin with verse number 29. Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu.